Thank you all for coming here today. I very much appreciate you coming to share some of your experiences. I hope that this is an ongoing dialogue, not just me talking to you. So I think some of the best results of a program like this really is the dialogue and the questions and the interaction. We had planned this topic, not this topic, but this session several months ago after meeting at the Ramadan dinner, as Ilker mentioned, but we didn't pick a topic. And we kind of locked in the date, left the topic open. And as the events unfolded in Ferguson, New York, Los Angeles, we started to see some of the demonstrations and things that occurred. The topic just really seemed to be natural. So we're going to talk a little bit about civil rights from a global perspective and then kind of narrow it down a little bit to policing and civil rights and further down into a little bit of kind of where we are today with what's happening in policing. First of all, I think we all know that America was really founded on our freedoms, whether it be freedoms of in the Constitution, so freedom of press, freedom of religion, and all those other rights that are in the Constitution. But it really has evolved, and we as a country, not too long ago, we're a segregated country where we had lots of civil rights issues, and we still have civil rights issues. We still have a lot to learn and a long ways to evolve. But I do think it's remarkable when we look back at where we were a short time ago, when I was very young and when my parents' generation grew up, of all the difficulties we had and how we as a society and as a government treated people. I do think that we're much better off in the way we treat people today, but we still, like I said, have a ways to go. I'd like to talk a little bit about not only that evolution, but how policing has evolved very similarly. We in policing have changed directions several times and evolved in many different ways. And for example, if you look back in the history of policing, the New York City Police Department was the first police department in our country. And then really all of the current community-based policing efforts and professionalization of policing mainly came from the West Coast. We saw a lot on the East Coast, but a lot of it started in the San Jose Police Department and started out here on the West Coast. And that all occurred roughly in about the 40s and the 50s. And you started to see much more of a professionalization of policing. We went from what was, I guess, perceived as knuckle-dragging police officers who could run and fight and shoot and catch bad guys, and that's all they could do, where it required only a GED. Even as short as 25 years ago when I joined policing, the minimum requirement was a GED. Some police departments didn't even require that around the country. But where I was at and where I grew up in Arizona and the police departments I was looking at here in California and Arizona, all was like an entry-level GED requirement. Since then, we have changed a lot in who we hire, who we attract, what we expect. Not only do we hire a lot of college-educated folks now, we demand a lot more of them in training and education throughout their career. So for example, when I started, again, 25 years ago, there were very few people with college degrees. When I came out of college and went into the academy, all of my peers were going off into the private sector or into, those that were going into the government sector or law enforcement were almost all exclusively going into federal law enforcement. And you didn't see many people come out of college, especially mainstream universities, and go into local policing. And you certainly didn't see people with master's degrees working for police departments. I attained my master's degree after I'd been at the police department for about 7 or 8 years, but there was only a handful of people out of 3,000 that had master's degrees. But you've since seen that completely change, where a significant portion of our staff has bachelor's degrees, many have master's degrees. Recently, the Los Alamitos Police Department here in Orange County made an announcement about 2 weeks ago. Their entire police force, from the brand new rookie officer all the way to the police chief, have at least bachelor's degrees or more. And I think that's a true testament to where we've come and what we're looking for, who we hire, and the skill that we demand of our police officers that we put on the street. One of the other things that's evolved is the training and the way we teach our officers. When I came on to the academy, it was about 12 weeks of training. And prior to that, not much time before that, in some places in the country, there wasn't even 12 weeks of training. But prior to that, it was just a week or two, maybe you'd ride with a senior officer. Some, it was nothing. They'd hand you a gun and badge and say, here's the law book, go out and figure it out. But now we train our officers for 6 months in a police academy. And then when they come out, we train them for 6 months with a field training officer where they're riding with a trainer who's evaluating them in a very structured program. So when they come out on the street, there's an entire book and a checklist of things that they have to go through and demonstrate proficiency in before we trust them out on their own by themselves to make literally life and death decisions. So the training is very extensive. It's much greater than it used to be. And in conjunction with that, we've also really evolved in our equipment and technology. Not just computers in the cars or things, but what we equip our police officers with in tools to deal with confrontations or non-compliant people. And when I came on the department, there was no such thing as a taser. We did not have pepper spray. We had very limited use of batons, and they used to use what they call saps and other very brutal pieces of equipment that were used in the civil rights era inappropriately. So there was a stigma to that as well. We since in policing have gone away from a lot of that. You'll see most officers now, and they used to also have revolvers with basically 6 bullets in a gun. And you've seen a lot of that change now to where most police officers, many police departments issue rifles, they issue semi-automatic handguns. Almost every officer in the country, probably 90% of the officers in the country are equipped with a taser. Very close to that many are equipped with pepper spray. And the reason for that is it provides a much more effective, humane, I guess you could say, way to deal with non-compliant suspects or subjects. We still have challenges, though, as we work through those tools and technologies as we've recently seen. Much of that technology, though, has tried to keep pace also with society. So when you look at the weaponry that we equip police officers with, it really has evolved. It's almost been an arms race with suspects and what they carry. And you look back to the North Hollywood bank shootout here in the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s, where if you weren't here, there was 2 suspects armed with AK-47 rifles that took hostages in a bank. And there was a shootout all through the streets of downtown Los Angeles where police officers had to go to sporting goods stores and gun stores and take guns and ammunition from them to go out and defend themselves in the community. We all learned from that. Even when I was in Arizona, we were students of that event. As we try to be in policing, we try to be, as you all in your industry as well, you are students of what we see happening elsewhere. And that really changed how we equip our officers and what we do with them before we send them out on the street. And it kind of brings me up a little bit to today, where we're at with some of the controversy and things that have happened of what we've witnessed in Missouri and New York, even locally here in Los Angeles, and some other places where we've had controversy surrounding deaths of people in our custody or when we're trying to take them into custody. And I don't want to get into specifics and nitpick each situation or anything like that, but I do think we as an industry, and I as a police chief and us as police officers, have a very root obligation to study each one of these and learn from them. Whether it results in a death or not, anytime we have any significant incident or use of force within our agency or elsewhere that we can see, we have a responsibility to try to learn from that and study what happened. I think if you were to talk to, let's take the controversy aside, if you could talk to the police chiefs in any of those jurisdictions, I guarantee you, I can't guarantee you, I would bet that all of them would say that there are lessons to be learned and things that could have been done differently. A lot of times when controversies erupt like this, the public face you see might be different. And it's very difficult. It gets legal issues involved and other things of when you can say you did something right or did something wrong. And we can debate legal merits of each one of these, but I think we in law enforcement look at each one of these and think, how could this have been done differently? And what could the officers have done differently? How could the agency have prepared the officers differently? But I also think society has a role to reflect on what kind of behavior should be anticipated in interactions with the police from the public. So I think there's an issue there on both sides of the issue, or a concern, and issues to learn from on both sides, whether it's the policing side or whether it's the protesting community, I guess you could say. But I do think we have a lot to learn from it. I also think one of our challenges in this area is the social media as well as the 24-hour news cycle media on cable shows. Everybody's looking for the latest line, the latest story, but we don't do a very good job in law enforcement keeping up with that. We like to circle the wagons and wait till our investigation's done, and it takes, 3 months or 4 months to get toxicology results back on an autopsy report. It takes all this time for us to really figure out the facts. We're very black and white, procedural-oriented people in policing, and it conflicts now with social media and with a little bit with the legal system and a little bit with what the public demands. And we haven't done a good job of keeping up with that. And I think we saw that in Ferguson, where the department was very slow to respond. The city was very slow to respond to what actually happened. And by the time they started to try to respond, it was through leaks of information, and it was very ineffective, and the whole narrative was lost as to really what happened. So a lot of the concern and controversy surrounding the incident in Ferguson really revolved around things that weren't true or inaccurate information. And we own some of that as a profession. And we try to learn from that, and some learn faster than others. Some departments do it better than others. And we're working on that, because I think there's an expectation in policing, and that expectation has grown with this evolution of policing and community-based policing. We used to not engage the community at all. It used to be just if you had an incident, you dealt with the police, that was it. And now we're out talking to groups like this. We're out doing community meetings and others, and meeting with our residents and trying to understand what they expect of the police. And we truly have worked in partnership to improve our neighborhoods, improve the quality of life in our neighborhoods. But what comes with that is the police are held to the expectations of the community. And the public expects officers to prevent and intervene in crime. With that expectation, we now expect our officers to go out and engage people in suspicious behavior, or when they're involved in criminal activity, or these minor offenses that are nuisances to neighborhoods. You saw that in New York. One of the hotly contested debates is Mr. Gardner there, who was ultimately died at the hands of the police. It was over selling illegal cigarettes, and is his life worth illegal cigarettes? But we as the police have an obligation to go out and make that contact and enforce that rule, that law, and that regulation for the quality of life in the neighborhood. Where we can get into all these debates over civil rights, so to speak, is how far do we take that as police? And that makes it very difficult for us sometimes. So we hire more educated officers, we train them better, we equip them better now, but it really still boils down to we send them out into the community to make contacts with people before somebody calls us, or sometimes in response to a call, but not while they're robbing a bank. But they may have to go out and stop somebody on the street that's walking down the street because of a lot of burglary activity in the neighborhood that involved a white guy wearing blue with stars on his collar in the neighborhood, from 2 to 4. So one of our police officers happens to be driving through the neighborhood that day and sees somebody wearing blue with stars on their collar. Between 2 and 4, they're going to contact them. And what that person's reaction to our officer is, and what our officer does and how they treat that person could become very, very important. So we really focus on trying to train our officers to make very good decisions very quickly. And the courts have interpreted the Constitution. The United States Supreme Court has a decision called Graham versus Connor. And it's an older decision, but it really is the Bible that all police officers live by when they stop and detain people and when they use force. And the court told us that whenever an officer approaches somebody with reason to believe a crime has been committed or crime is afoot, and they reasonably believe that that person may be involved in that crime, they can stop that person. And that person has the obligation to submit to the officer's authority. The officer has the right to use as much force as reasonably necessary to detain that person. We all would agree it's not reasonably necessary under just a simple vanilla set of facts to say that, resulting in death or serious injury over illegal alcohol or anything else is worth that. The problem becomes it usually escalates into a threatening situation in the officer's mind. And the court has said that an officer can use that force which he or she believes is reasonable, given the facts at the time, at the moment they use the force. And the court's very specific. It says it doesn't matter if a week later you learn something or if an hour later you learn something. It's what the officer believed and what was in his or her mind at the moment. And that's where we get a lot of controversy in some of these instances. So if you look at an incident like Ferguson, where the officer believed his life was in danger after he was struck in the face, trapped in his police car and struggling over his gun, we can debate that. But the courts have given us very strict guidelines that officer has that legal authority to use that force which he or she thinks is reasonable and necessary at the time. So back to the management side of that, we really try to train and equip our officers to make the best decisions possible of how they approach people, how they talk to people, using more officers on scene to de-escalate things, using better communication to de-escalate things. But again, we still have a ways to go. I think we as a profession have a ways to go to become more approachable and accessible to the community, but also in our interactions with the community. But I truly believe, and I think most of you that have raised children will understand this as well, is we have a ways to go as society as to what some of our kids are learning and the way some of our young people treat authority and the police and how these things go sideways. And we have to learn from each other. I don't want to get too bogged down on that. Let me make sure I'm keeping up here. I think one of the things that we, when I talked about us losing control of the narrative with Ferguson and other things, whenever and we've seen this with other incidents outside of policing, whenever there is a quick controversy that catches on in the news media and social media now, it very quickly becomes about perception and not necessarily reality. For us in police work, that perception becomes our reality. I think the perception right now in many people's minds is some of these cities are out beating people every day or using all kinds of force on people every day. And in reality, we use force in 1.5% of our contacts with people nationally. So for example, in Huntington Beach, we may arrest up to 5,000 people in a year. And that doesn't count all of our other contacts with people that don't result in arrest. And we use force about 200 times a year. And when you think 200 times a year in the size of Huntington Beach, that's actually fairly significant. But it's less than 1.5% even of overall contacts. We average about one shooting a year where one of our police officers has to use their weapon to defend their own life or somebody else's life. And we also average roughly just almost one in custody death every year, which means somebody dies in our custody after we've struggled with them or whatnot. One of the things that I think people have a hard time understanding is that isn't a new phenomenon. It's not because of tasers, it's not because of chokeholds or anything else. That's been going on since the 1800s. And people have died in police custody for many years since the 1800s. And there's many reasons for that. It gets very complicated and very technical. But it usually involves kind of a perfect storm of circumstances involving the person's health, the duration of the struggle they're involved in. It could have a contributing factor of a taser being involved or too many officers putting too much weight on the person when they're on the ground, things like that. So we are very cognizant of that. We train every year. We train our officers for 40 hours a week in how to use force and make them practice it over and over and over again for 40 hours every year. And when we do that, we teach them techniques to not put people in positions that we've learned from, like the Eric Garner situation in New York. We use some of the techniques that you could see in that video there, but we use them differently, and we train in them every year, and our officers have to get certified, so to speak, by an instructor who monitors them while they're doing it, and they basically are passing a practical test. So we've worked very hard over the years, not just in Huntington Beach, but in policing, and it's much more difficult for the bigger cities like New York and Los Angeles to get all their officers through that much training. That's one of the luxuries we have in Huntington Beach is to really put our officers through some intense training. And we have a use of force expert that is kind of cutting edge on hands-on physical application of force and does a great job at teaching our officers to use it with the minimal impact possible. One of the other quick things that I wanted to mention when we talk about this on a large scale or a national scale of responsibility and use of force and things like that, one of the things that we are trying to get out to the community, whether it's in Huntington Beach or elsewhere, is there is a forum and a way, and the California Government Code requires it, that every police department accept and investigate citizens' complaints and that we produce those results. So if you're ever contacted by the police and you don't agree with that contact, you can come in and talk to a supervisor about it. They're required by law to take your complaint, document your complaint. We're required to investigate that. We audit those. We have on average about 70 complaints a year that come in against our officers in Huntington Beach for a variety of reasons. Some of those complaints are generated internally, even by our supervisors that see something that isn't right, that rises to the level of where it requires a formal investigation instead of a supervisor saying, hey, young man, don't do that again, do this next time. We do that all the time, every day. But there are other times, about half of those 70 are internally generated where our supervisory staff sees something that is inappropriate that requires us to do an investigation. The other half are citizens that come in and complain. And we get a lot of inquiries over email just asking why an officer did something, or they'll call me or they'll call the department and say, why did this police officer do this? And we can explain it. That's not a complaint. The complaints are where they call in and they're adamant that the officer violated their civil rights or did something they shouldn't have done. And we do an investigation into that. So if you take those 70 and about half are generated by citizens, of those half, about 25%, so if you, about that 35, if you take about 25% of that 35, somewhere between 10 and 12, result in a finding against the officers where they did something wrong. So we do find our officers responsible for doing things wrong. We do hold them accountable. They do get disciplined. The difficulty with us is the California Government Code requires that to be secret. And it requires that to be, and when I say difficult, it's good and bad. So it's required to be secret. It's a personnel matter. It's not released to the public. I can't discuss that with all of you on an individual basis. I can't stand up here and say, Officer X that went out and arrested that person and took him to jail and shouldn't have. I can't say that. I can't talk about those specifics. And that creates a lot of challenges for us. In Arizona, where I came from and grew up in law enforcement, all of that was public record. And it was all on display. So if we did a 80-page internal investigation and disciplined an officer, their name, everything that was alleged, everything that was found, the tactics used, all of that was public record. It's not that way in California. So from a transparency standpoint, I think we're a little behind some other states. Washington, California, and others have those laws. Yes, sir.
Did they give you a reason on why you can't make those public?
Well, it's in the government code, and it's in what they call the Police Officer Bill of Rights, which was passed many years ago here in California, and it's similar to teachers. Some people use information that they can get in bits and pieces, and they use it against officers in inappropriate ways, whether it's stalking them and their families or injuring or harming police officers. So some of that was done for that reason. So there's a balance in there somewhere, and I think we're seeing as a society a pushback to that secrecy that we have right now in California. And I think you'll see some legislation. There's already been some legislation introduced just this year on some changes based on this national controversy we see. Much of it revolves around what tools we carry, how we acquire them, and then also body-worn cameras. So those things, I think, are all going to be topics, not just in this legislative session, but for some time to come, about what we can share, what we can talk about. As far as I'm concerned, as a police chief, we should be an open book. We should be an open book, and I have every responsibility to come up here and own the mistakes we make. And learn from those mistakes. We are going to make mistakes, and that's the thing we have to also get across to the community. We can't expect our police department to be 100% perfect every time with every interaction. They're human beings. We can train and teach our police officers to do the best they can and perform at a very high level, but we are going to make mistakes based on the number of contacts we have, based on the very complex environment we work within. But we have to be able to own those mistakes, learn from them, and move on. The problem is when we make mistakes, sometimes it has lethal consequences. A very small mistake from a police officer in performance can have very, very serious results for somebody. And how do you balance that? How do you balance that when an officer makes a mistake in judgment that is very, very minor on the scope but has very bad results? And it's a balance for us. It's an extreme balance for us. We struggle with that in policing all the time. What I'd like to do now, I kind of got a little off track and jumped around, but I'd like to open it up for questions, talk a little bit about, we can talk about specifics in Huntington Beach, we can talk about Orange County, we can talk about, in California or nationally. I am a little bit of a student of the profession. I've spent the last 25 years. One of the things that's not in my biography is I worked for the Immigration and Naturalization Service for a year and a half before joining the Phoenix Police Department. Started as an internship there in college and went to work for them. And the experience of some of what the federal government does versus what the local governments do and all of that has really caused me to be a student of law enforcement and federal and local governments and public administration. That's where you see my educational background in, as well as just in government in general. So